Hello, and welcome to Wednesday at Bear Branch, a virtual ministry of the Churches of Christ. We are now rebroadcasting the study of the fourfold gospel compiled by Brother J. W. McGarvey, taught by Brother Brian Barrett, who preaches for our congregation here at Bear Branch in Spurlockville, West Virginia. We hope that you will find the lessons profitable in the study of God's Word and enlightening to the Christian walk. Brother Barrett has been a preacher and teacher in the Churches of Christ for over 40 years, a frequent speaker in gospel meetings, revivals, having worked in TV and radio, and now our internet ministry. You may obtain a copy of Brother J. W. McGarvey's The Fourfold Gospel at our website, www.thechurchesofchrist.life, on our Fourfold Gospel page. You may use either the online copy or download the volume from this site. Both are free to use. We now invite you to open your Bibles and the Fourfold Gospel. Follow along in our lesson of the hour. Now, here's Brian.
Tonight we're studying in the book of Matthew, the second chapter, and we're going to start in verses 13 through 18. As we left off last week in our study, in verse 12, we had been looking at the wise men, the Magi, who came looking for Jesus after his birth, and having been warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, we're told at the end of verse 12, they departed into their own country another way. So tonight, as we go into this particular section, if you're following along in the book, this will be section 14, Matthew 2, 13 through 18. And so they returned back to the east. The wise men, the Magi, came from the east, and they returned back going another way, perhaps down through Jericho and across the Jordan and back in that direction, although we don't have a lot of specifics on that. And so in verse 13, as we start this evening, and J.W. McGarvey's book is based on the American Standard Version, so if what I'm reading seems a little strange, we don't normally use the American Standard, but that's the way that's the translation that the book used. In verse 13, it says, "Now when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise and take the young child and his mother and flee into Egypt, and be there until I tell thee, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. And he arose and took the young child and his mother by night and departed into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt did I call my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceedingly wroth, and sent forth and slew all the male children that were in Bethlehem. And we're told thereof from 2 years old, according to the time which he had exactly learned of the wise men. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet, saying, A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she would not be comforted because they are not. So we're going to just kind of work with that right now for a few minutes, and then we'll see how far we get into the lesson tonight. Once again, Joseph, in a dream, is warned by the angel of God concerning the hatred and the ill will that Herod has. Now, this would not have taken God by surprise. He already knew these things would take place, as we can see, as Matthew records fulfillment of certain prophecies. And he was warned to take the young child and his mother and flee into Egypt. As we were talking last week, we talk about the fact that the so-called Christmas story that we hear is not very accurate. First of all, we don't know how many wise men there were. The only reason we use 3 is because there were 3 gifts, but that doesn't mean that there were only 3. Could have been more, could have been less. There were wise men or magi, and so it would have to probably be at least 2 to be a plurality, but we don't know how many actually came. But this was part of God's providence and his preparation in sending the magi to pay tribute or honor to the newborn king, in bringing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, 3 very expensive items. Joseph now had the things that he needed in order to go into Egypt. He did not and had not been planning for these kind of things to happen. He was probably getting ready to go back to Nazareth and start his life, as we said, with Mary and the baby Jesus and get started. But being warned in a dream that Herod would try to take his life, and because, as we talked about last week, Herod was a little weird. And so, he needed some severe medication and therapy. He was the kind of man who would kill anybody who got in his way. If you've ever watched anything on the History Channel about Herod the Great, you'll understand. Didn't matter if he killed his brother, sister, mother, father. It didn't matter to him who it was that was in his way. And so, having been being plagued with the idea that there was a new king to replace him born, his solution was an easy one. We'll just kill all the male children in Bethlehem, and that ought to take care of it. If we, having checked with the wise men and knowing when they first saw the star and having already got some information from them, he apparently estimated, we might say guesstimated, that any child that was under the age of 2 years would perhaps qualify as one who could be the fulfillment of that. Any child older would not have been a part of what was going on, so he supposed. And so he sent those of his authority, or those under his authority, into Bethlehem, which was the city that the prophets had prophesied that the Messiah, the son of David, would be born. That's the city of David. And so Herod figured that, since he was supposed to come from Bethlehem, all he needed to do was kill the children, the infants there in Bethlehem that were less than 2 years of age, and that would pretty much clean up his problem. And so Joseph was told to go into Egypt until such time as he would be instructed to return back into the Holy Land. And it's interesting, it says, and he arose and took the young child and his mother by night and departed into Egypt. The idea of that verse seems to be that he really made haste. He did not spend a lot of time. He didn't wait 2 or 3 days. He was traveling probably light to start with because they had came down to Bethlehem, intended to go back to Nazareth. And so we're told that he arose, took the young child and his mother, and departed into Egypt. and the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh made it easy to facilitate that. At that time, they didn't really have ATMs. You couldn't go in the middle of the night and withdraw money out of an ATM and do all the things we would do today to get things. So God, through his providence, prepared a way in which he could, after the wise men had left, take them and go into Egypt. And we're told that he was there until the death of Herod. Now, this is where, again, we get into a lot of, yes?
Do you think he sent him to Egypt?
Because that was probably the last place that Herod would look.
I was thinking maybe the fact that the Israelites didn't walk Egypt at one time, maybe the
Well, depending on how he felt about the situation, Herod may have attempted to go in a wider area. He really only had authority in the area of what we think of as the Holy Land. And so that's the area he had authority in. And since it was Bethlehem, he thought that he could kind of tidily wrap it all up. But this assures, with Jesus being in Egypt, that any thoughts of him would be, there may very well been the concept of people asking questions. Has there been any children born around here lately? Do you know their name? Do you know where they're from? I don't know to what extent they asked questions. Herod wanted any child that was born there in Bethlehem under the age of 2 to basically be put to death or to be assassinated. And so if they ask a lot of questions, the best that they were going to be able to get was, well, there was a man and his wife that was here, and their name was Joseph and Mary, and they had a son, and they were out of Nazareth or whatever. And so if anybody tried to chase him into Galilee and into the city of Nazareth, he wouldn't be there. So just as you said, the Israelites used to be in Egypt, and so they came out of Egypt, and the Israelites and those of Egypt kind of had some conflicts. There's still kind of conflicts even today. And so to me, it just seems like it'd be the last place that anybody would look for an Israelite to go to. Somebody's at the back door there. It's locked. Somebody's pulling on the door. The death of Herod took place, we're told, somewhere around 4 BC. And so we're looking at this time frame that we've been discussing. I know it seems strange, but Jesus was probably born somewhere around 6 up to 4 BC, because Herod died in what we know now to be approximately 4 BC. And I know that Christ can't be born before he's born, but by our way of dating, there was some mistakes made in certain events and a time frame that was attached to them. And so looking at the birth of Jesus and speaking here about what we hear of 2 years and under, that was what Herod believed from the time that they had seen the star and those events. So if he died in 4 BC, then that would mean that rolling it back approximately 2 years would be 6 BC. And so anywhere from 6 to 4 BC could have been the time that Jesus was born. And as we said, there is no December the 25th. That's just, again, another, nobody knows when Jesus was born other than God and Joseph and Mary, who have already passed on. And so there is nothing in the scriptures that tell us when what month, what day, even what year. Matter of fact, when Jesus began his earthly ministry, as we said before, it's merely stated he began his ministry being of the age of 30 as it was supposed. And so they supposed, that doesn't mean he was 30, it just means they supposed he was 30. And there's a big difference between being and supposing. So the Bible is very careful, really, to not give us much information about the birth of Jesus as far as a year, month, date, for various reasons. And I don't, again, we don't necessarily get back into all that again. But if Herod died at 4 BC, and he was the one who ordered the death of the infants 2 years and before, then we're looking at a time frame of between 6 BC and 4 BC as the time that Jesus was born, because Joseph and Mary would have had to go into Egypt. And how long Joseph and Mary was in Egypt would depend on whether Jesus was born in 6 BC, 5 BC, or 4 BC. And we have no idea. And so the only thing we know is that, in a way, the path of Herod and Jesus come together here in the account with the wise men, and this took place before Herod died. And so it's possible that Jesus was with Mary and Joseph in Egypt for upwards of 2 years, give or take. And so we have that to work with, but not much more. Anybody have any questions or comments down so far?
Is Egypt a big city, a big area?
Country, yes.
They could have got lost easy in that.
Yes. And of course, I don't know if they used their own names. This is at a time where you don't carry passports and you don't have photo IDs and you don't have all those things. And so if someone says, "What's your name?" and, he said John Henry, then, what are you going to do? And so, whatever name that you give is the name you were called by. And unless there was somebody to question it, so I don't even know if Joseph and Mary used their real names while they were there. And Jesus would have been an infant, so he wouldn't have, again, interacted with anyone other than General Goo and Koo and maybe Mama and Dad, or the equivalent of that, Abba, I guess, in the Greek. But as we look at this, as depending on how long they were there, we mentioned this in a previous lesson, but depending on how long they were there, if it was a short period of time, then those who came back out of Egypt would have been Joseph and Mary and Jesus. If they were there for a period of time, it's quite possible that Mary could have had another child while they were there. But, we don't have, as I said, a lot of time to work with. We're looking at by today's standards, and these dates are historical dates. And so looking at Roman records, looking at things that Josephus wrote, trying to get these dates right. And as we mentioned last week, a lot of people say, well, why isn't there a lot of records? Why couldn't they use a lot of the records that were there in Jerusalem or in the land of Galilee? And the Romans came and destroyed everything from Galilee down to and including Jerusalem in AD 70. And so with that, all records were pretty much destroyed other than the historical record that Josephus made and whatever documents Rome would have kept and taken with them when they left out of Jerusalem after the destruction of the city in 70 AD. And as John writes this, he's writing this probably after the destruction of Jerusalem, which would run this up to 80 or 90, at least AD. So the events that John is talking about here, remember, there wasn't a official dating of BC and AD among the Romans and among the Jews. The Jews still have their own way of keeping track of things. And in the Jewish way of keeping track, the year is like 5,700 and something. I forget what the date is exactly, but in the Jewish calendar, it's they keep track of it supposedly after the creation. So it's 5,700 and some years after the creation. And it was based on their calendars, and there is no records of all that stuff. Any recording that would have been made of Joseph and Mary when they were preparing for the taxation, again, after Jerusalem was destroyed, after they went to war with that, none of that mattered anymore. And of course, that was, 70 years before the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. So those records would have been out of date anyway. So most government agencies, unless they're really, really storing stuff up after 50, 60, 70 years, they're not going to be keeping paperwork that was under another governor and in a different time. So as much as we have in the scriptures about the birth of Jesus is very abbreviated. We have limited information about that. And it speaks here that they were there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet. And this is in Hosea 11:1, saying, "Out of Egypt did I call my son." And this goes back and echoes words out of Exodus 4:22 and 23 also. And this is some of the things that Matthew writes. John writes at a different time. Matthew probably wrote somewhere around 60 AD. And so still, even what we're looking at here with Matthew and some of those, we know that Luke wrote during the time of Paul's imprisonment. And so Luke wrote his epistle and the book of Acts somewhere after 60 AD because the Apostle Paul, Peter, and others were killed under Nero prior to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. So even when these books were written, they were way down the road as far as time-wise. The Gospels weren't written right off the bat. They weren't fresh off the presses. They were written many years, pretty much generation past the time that Jesus lived and died, after the first generation of the church. And these documents were prepared so as those who could not and would not be able to see and talk to an apostle would have an inspired record from the Holy Spirit to continue to guide them. In verse 16, we're told that Herod, when he saw that he was mocked by the wise men, was very angry, wroth, sent forth what Brother McGarvey calls murderers, and they slew the children there in the city. There has been discussion over how many perhaps would have died, and it's all, just guesswork as to how many people would be living in Bethlehem at that time, and how many of those people at that time would have had children at that time, 2 years and under. And so some people have been as low as 20 to 50, as Brother McGarvey speaks of, as an estimate, some more than that. And so we're all over the place with that. And there is no real discussion other than the fact that in the city of Bethlehem, every child that was under the age of 2 was executed under the authority of Herod. And it specifies here that it was in Bethlehem. And Brother McGarvey puts a note in here. It says Bethlehem was not a large place. And so that's what he assumes and why he assumes there may not have been a great number of infants that were killed. And it talks about at all the borders, and that would be the adjacent areas around Bethlehem. Much like today, cities have a border, the official border of the city, and many of these cities were walled cities, and so they had walls around the city, but for a period and a space out around the town, just today we call them suburbs, but in that day and age, those who had land just outside the city, and I forget how many feet it was, I'm kind of thinking about 1,500 yards, but I could be mistaken on that. But there was a limitation as to what pertained to that city, and that was so that the people of the city could have their animals out there, place for a pasture, place for them to be able to have gardens, and a place to provide things for those who were living in the city. And so when they sent these individuals from Herod, in order to comply with that and make sure that, they dotted their I's and crossed their T's. They made sure that all of the land that pertained to Bethlehem and all what we would think of today as the suburb, they managed to find and to execute all of those. And that was according to the time which Herod had learned from the wise men about these events beginning to happen. And Brother McGarvey makes a lot of comments, a lot of other people make comments about, why 2 years? I mean, was it really 2 years when Jesus was born? And had it really been 2 years? Did they need to kill people that were 2 years, children that was 2 years or under? And Herod had spoken to the wise men about the star when they had seen it, and he had gotten some information. But as I've said before, Herod was also a very paranoid man. And so if they said it was a year ago, if they said it was 6 months ago, if whatever they told him, Herod would, since they didn't come back, would assume that whatever time frame that they gave him would not have been correct. So Brother McGarvey believes that by using the number of 2 years and under, he kind of did the rule of thumb thing, and he knew that it probably wasn't before that, and so that's where he comes up with the age of 2 years. Any questions or comments? Anything else on that? I mean, we need to understand it didn't kill every child under the age of 2 in all of Judea and all of Galilee and in all the Holy Land. It was just those that pertained to Bethlehem, because that's where Jesus was supposed to come from. And as we have seen in our Sunday morning study, early on in the book of John, when they're talking about having found Jesus and having found the Messiah, it's Jesus of Nazareth. The statement is, any good thing come out of Nazareth? Nobody was really looking for anything good to come out of Nazareth. And even later on, the Jewish leaders said, check the scriptures, check the prophets, because no prophets prophesy. There's no prophecies about anyone coming out of Galilee. And so this is the fulfillment of the prophecy back in Jeremiah 31 and 15. And just make a comment here about the weeping that was there at the death of the children. There's an interesting sidebar here that I think we kind of need to look at. And Brother McGarvey, in his book here, he puts that in there. And so I'll just go over it for because it is something that comes up from time to time. In dealing with certain aspects, there is three different ways in which prophecy is applied in the New Testament, the way that it's seen to be applied. And the first is a direct prophecy which wholly and in of itself applies specifically to the event which is taking place. And we would say that if we look at Isaiah 53, when it talks about Jesus and about his rejection and being crucified and beaten and all of that, that specifically talks to the crucifixion and the suffering of Jesus. The second way in which prophecy is used is that an act described is in its way symbolic of an event which will later take place. And so we see that used, that it has a fulfillment in the present tense or the present time, but then it also has a future application. And then there is the last case that Brother McGarvey mentions, and that is something that doesn't even appear to apply to the events. People would never connect the dots on that. And here specifically, he uses the example that we have of Jeremiah 31:15. It is specifically talking about the suffering of the women in the city of Jerusalem that Jeremiah experienced after Babylon came and destroyed the city. And so it was fulfilled specifically in that, and it didn't necessarily look toward the destruction or the killing of the children in Bethlehem. However, an application of that was made by Matthew here in this. And so that's sometimes is hard for some people to put the pieces together. So we have something that's specifically prophesied and then it's fulfilled, and it just has that one place. There's another thing where an event that takes place here also applies to something that's there, and it's a twofold type prophecy, such as the prophecy made to David about Solomon and building the temple and sitting on his throne, but it also applied to the descendants of David, which ultimately was Christ. And so that had application there and then application here. And in this particular sense, they're going back and taking a prophecy that really wasn't specifically intended for that event, but the suffering and things that were experienced would be on the same scale as that. So the prophecy is used to just get us to understand the severe nature, how severe was the slaughter of the infants there. And if you want to go back to Jeremiah or go back to the book of Ezekiel, or not Ezekiel, but Lamentations, you can see some of the events that took place there. And as he says, Matthew says, she would not be comforted because they're not. It's very difficult for a parent to lose a child, and there really is no comfort for that. There's really no comfort when we lose anyone, but there is a special grief that a parent goes through when they lose a child, because that's just not the way that we're set up to think. We expect that our grandparents are going to pass away, and we expect our parents will pass away, and we expect them to live good, long life. And then when a child, in this particular case, 2 years or under, dies and is put to death, literally, everything that it would everything that it would have been, everything that the family had. And no matter how many more children you have, there's that one which we just, there's no comfort. You can have another child, but that's not going to fix the loss or the problem and the devastation that was experienced with. And you can imagine soldiers and people from Herod, for all intents and purposes, kicking down your front door and coming in and killing your child right there in front of you, and leaving you then to deal with the mess of having to bury your child and to witness that and to see it. And so the terrible nature of that parallels what was mentioned back in Jeremiah. And so the Holy Spirit in Matthew gives some sense or idea of the suffering that was there in Bethlehem at this time for all that they experienced. Any questions or comments? We are going to continue on in Matthew 2, verses 19 through 23. And there's a couple places, one place maybe that we're also going to see the parallel with Luke. And if you're looking at the book, you'll see that it has it has Matthew 2, 19 through 23, and then it has C, which is Luke 2 through 39. And we have mentioned this early on. The further we get into this study and the more that all three or all four of the writers are commenting on the same thing, where there is some added information, we'll see it inserted here. We may be in one particular book, but where they will add something from the other book and they'll put all that scripture together. And so as we come into verse 19, we have Mary and Joseph and Jesus going into Egypt. There they stayed. And then when Herod was dead, an angel of the Lord once again appears in a dream to Joseph while he's in Egypt, saying, "Arise and take the young child and his mother and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead that sought the child's life." And he arose and took the young child and his mother and came into the land of Israel. And again, Brother McGarvey puts the date of this as 4 BC because that's when, as best historians can tell, Herod died. And we're told that he died in the 37th year of his reign. From a historical concept, Josephus and others speak about this from a historical standpoint, not a scriptural standpoint. But at the death of Herod, an angel appears in a dream to Joseph. And this is an interesting way of dealing with the return of Jesus. Something's going to happen when they come back into the land. And so things aren't as straightforward as they think they are. So it's interesting that God chose to only reveal certain things at certain times because there may have been those who, keeping in their father's footsteps, might have wanted, if they considered that Jesus might even be the one who would be after their throne. And so they could have told Joseph, stay a while longer. But they told him that Herod was dead. And so Joseph makes the journey back into the Holy Land, only to find that a descendant of Herod is sitting on the throne. One of his sons are still there. And so this this is where God gives you so much information now, and then he gives you the rest of the information later, so as to get Joseph to move back. And I'm sure as a parent, if there was any chance that our child is going to be hurt or harmed, we're not going to go back. And so, especially since Joseph and Mary both knew the solemn charge that was given to them about who Jesus was and what he was supposed to accomplish. And so God chose to limit how much information that they received to get them out of Egypt and back in to the Holy Land, and then give them the rest of the information to move them back. So they didn't settle back in Bethlehem, but they actually end up back in Galilee, and specifically in the city of Nazareth. And we'll look at that as we go on. We may not get into all that tonight. But as he was told, he arose, took the young child and his mother, and they came back into the land of Israel. And it says, but when he heard that Archelaus reigned instead of his father over Judea, who was the son of Herod, he was afraid to go into the land of Judea. And again, being warned in a dream, he withdrew into the parts of Galilee and dwelt in the city called Nazareth. Herod had a tight grip on his kingdom. But it's interesting, Herod built the temple that was there in Jerusalem for the Jews, and Herod built a lot of things. He liked to build. It's sort of like making a name for himself. And it's interesting to me, when Herod died, instead of giving the land of Israel, which would have been Galilee and Judea and all that, to his eldest son, which would be the normal way to do it, in his will, he appealed to Caesar, Augustus Caesar, to divide his kingdom into 3 parts and give part of his kingdom to each of his 3 sons. And thus, they wouldn't ever be as big and grand and glorious as Papa was. They don't call him Herod the Great for no reason whatsoever. And
why not make this the day that you and your family seek out the Church of Christ in your community? We encourage you to attend one of our worship times or Bible studies. God's grace, truth, and salvation is truly worth finding and knowing. May God bless and keep you as we walk together in His truth. And remember, as always, the Churches of Christ salute you. Our new programs are posted to Facebook and YouTube on Thursday afternoon, and they should be available for viewing by 7 p.m. We also encourage our viewers to visit our website at www.thechurchesofchrist.life. We ask that you like us on Facebook and share our programs. On YouTube, please share and subscribe for notifications. This program was pre-recorded.